Tonight, we uncover a secret older than the Church itself, a faith of fire and truth buried beneath cathedrals and rewritten scriptures, the story of an ancient religion that once lit empires, only to be hunted, erased, and sealed beneath the Vatican's darkest vaults. These are the Zoroastrian secrets the Vatican tried to destroy. They say there was once a belief so pure, so dangerous, that it needed no temple, no priest, no permission. A faith built on the idea that truth was not to be worshipped, but lived. That every human being carried within them a spark of divine fire, a conscience brighter than any altar flame. But light like that cannot be controlled, and so, across centuries, it was silenced. The Magi, the keepers of fire, were recast as mystics and magicians. Their scriptures, the Avesta, were burned, stolen, or sealed away under the guise of heresy. Even their gods were renamed, their temples rebuilt as cathedrals, their wisdom disguised as miracles. What survived were fragments, smuggled along trade routes, whispered by exiles, hidden in the folds of myth and masonry. But in those fragments lies a story the Vatican never wanted told. Because the teachings of Zoroaster were not about obedience or fear, they were about awareness, free will, and the sacred law of truth itself. Asha, they called it. The rhythm of creation, the mirror of reality, a force that exists beyond any throne or scripture. To live in Asha was to see clearly, to act rightly, to become light itself. And for those who built power from darkness, that was unforgivable. Throughout history, traces of this forbidden wisdom have appeared where few expected them. In the geometry of cathedrals that follow the path of the Sunday, in saints whose bones bear Persian inscriptions, in the writings of monks who studied stars that Rome had forbidden them to name. Each piece points to the same origin, a lost fire that once guided the conscience of humanity. But who were the ones who kept it alive, and what did they risk to preserve it? Somewhere in the Vatican's endless vaults, there are said to be sealed cases labelled Persica. No catalogue, no access, no explanation. Just the faint scent of parchment and ash. Perhaps inside them lies what the Church tried to erase. Or perhaps the real secret was never in the archives at all, but in us. Tonight, we trace the hidden light of an ancient faith that refused to die. A fire the Vatican could not extinguish. A truth that still burns behind the walls of silence. So, before we begin, remember this. The greatest secret in history was never about how to worship. It was about how to see. And once you see it, nothing stays dark for long. We step into a place few have ever seen, a world beneath Rome where marble gives way to stone and the air hums with the weight of secrets. They say that somewhere under Vatican Hill, past locked iron gates and halls too old for maps, there burns a flame that was never meant to go out. Not a candle, not a relic, but an ember from a fire older than Christianity itself, a fire once tended by priests who spoke the language of the stars, the same language that would one day be forbidden. Beneath centuries of gold and silence, the Vatican guards more than bones and scrolls. It guards memory. Some call it legend, others call it rumour. But in the dark corridors below St. Peter's Basilica, archivists whisper about a sealed chamber. Inside it, a collection of manuscripts unlike anything in the Church's records. They were said to be written in Avestan, the sacred language of Zoroaster, the prophet of light. The words inside those books did not preach obedience or sin, but balance, truth, and the eternal battle between good and evil inside every human being. To the ancient Persians, fire wasn't worshipped as a god. It was treated as a mirror of conscience, a living symbol of clarity. Every flicker a reminder that purity wasn't something you received from priests. It was something you kept alive within yourself. To the early church, that idea was dangerous, because if truth lived in every person's heart, then no one could claim to control it. That was a threat greater than any empire. In the 3rd century, as Rome spread across the known world, travelers brought strange teachings from the East. Among them were stories of Zoroaster, a man who taught that the universe was divided not by gods, but by choice. That every thought, every word, every action tilted the balance of existence toward light or shadow. No blood sacrifices, no intermediaries, only responsibility. But in a city built on hierarchy, that kind of freedom couldn't survive, so it was buried. Some say the manuscripts arrived in Rome during the reign of Constantine, taken from a Persian library as trophies of conquest. Others claim they were brought secretly by scholars fleeing the fall of Ctesiphon, smuggled in the hollow of a statue meant for the Vatican's own museum. Whatever their path, their trail ends beneath the Apostolic Archive, in a vault labelled only with a number, not a name. The Vatican calls it fiction. Yet letters from early Jesuits mention Persian codices of flame and wisdom locked away for translation that never came. Why hide them? Because those texts spoke of a light that belonged to everyone. They said salvation was not in ritual, but in awareness, that the divine spark wasn't above us, but inside us, and if the world ever remembered that, no wall of dogma could hold. So, the Church kept the ember behind the door, where no wind could reach it, and where no one would think to look, but fire, even hidden, still glows, and sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, the stone beneath Rome still feels warm. There was once a word that frightened kings more than any sword, Mazdayasna. It meant the worship of wisdom. To those who spoke Avestan, it was not a religion but a relationship with truth itself. To know it was to live by clarity, to question falsehood, and to recognize the sacred in thought. But when that word crossed into the libraries of Rome, it began to vanish. Scribes stared at it, uncertain how to translate something that made priests unnecessary, so they changed it. They turned the worship of wisdom into the worship of idols. They labelled its prophets as pagans. And in the quiet of candlelight, one stroke of a quill began to erase an entire philosophy. It started slowly. In the 5th century, a few Latin commentaries dismissed the Persians as fire worshippers. By the 10th, their name had turned into a warning. Mazdayasna became Magianism, then sorcery, then heresy. Every translation dulled the light a little more until the original meaning was unrecognizable. Those who remembered it whispered that the corruption was intentional, that the Church could not allow a faith based on personal reason and moral choice to survive, because if every person could find God through wisdom, then no cathedral would be needed to reach him. Somewhere in the archives of Constantinople, a monk once wrote that certain Eastern texts were too dangerous for simple minds. He did not destroy them, he simply renamed them. And in doing so, he ensured that their truth would sleep beneath layers of language for 1,000 years. The process was elegant. A word changed here, a context altered there. Fire became vanity. Light became pride. Knowledge became temptation. To the eyes of later readers, Mazdayasna looked less like devotion and more like rebellion. The followers of wisdom were no longer seekers of truth, but enemies of order. Yet behind the rewritten pages, the old message still whispered. The Persians had believed that truth, called Asher, was the structure of the universe. To live against it was to live in illusion. To honour it was to live in harmony. This was not mythology. It was philosophy disguised as faith, and that was the danger. When early Christian theologians studied Persian dualism, they found uncomfortable similarities. Heaven and hell, light and darkness, free will and deception. But instead of admitting the connection, they buried it. They claimed revelation instead of inheritance. Over time, the original word, Mazdayasna, was forgotten even by scholars. Only fragments in medieval glossaries survived, describing it as an extinct cult of wisdom and flame, a small description for something that once defined civilizations. Yet even lost words leave shadows. The idea behind them never dies, it only hides. waiting for someone to read between the lines. Somewhere in the Vatican's oldest dictionaries, faded ink still carries the ghost of that name, and perhaps that is enough, because wisdom does not need monuments to survive. It only needs one mind brave enough to remember what others chose to forget. Long before a star appeared over Bethlehem, long before shepherds and kings followed its light, there were the Magi. Not magicians, as stories would later claim, but priests of the sky, guardians of a knowledge so old that even empires bowed to it. They were astronomers who believed the heavens were not random. Each star was a word, each constellation a sentence, together forming a language of morality written across the night. When they studied the sky, they were not predicting fate, they were reading ethics. The Magi taught that the universe responded to the quality of human thought, that every action echoed through the cosmos like ripples on a lake. They called it Asher, the truth that orders creation, and they believed that by aligning one's thoughts, words and deeds with that truth, reality itself could be purified. Theirs was not a faith of worship, but of participation. They did not pray for miracles. They created them through harmony. In Persia's high deserts, where the horizon was wide and the stars endless, their temples were open to the night. A sacred flame burned at the center, not as a god, but as a symbol of perception. To the Magi, fire was perfect. It illuminated, it warmed, and it consumed impurity without corruption. Every lesson began with tending the flame, because to keep it steady was to keep the mind steady. To let it flicker was to let darkness creep in. When travellers from the west arrived, they were astonished. Here were priests who needed no idols, no sacrifice, only truth. Their faith was disciplined yet free, guided by conscience rather than command. The Romans, obsessed with hierarchy, found this both fascinating and dangerous. The Magi believed that salvation could not be bought with offerings, but earned through integrity. Their law was simple: good thoughts, good words, good deeds, nothing else. Every lie was a shadow cast on the soul. Every act of kindness, a spark of divine fire. This was the original gospel of the Magi, and it would travel far. Centuries later, when tales of three wise men spread across the Christian world, their image was changed. The sky readers of Persia became exotic strangers kneeling before a child, their wisdom reduced to prophecy, their science forgotten. Yet the truth remains. The star they followed was not a miracle in the sky, but a pattern they had long known, a rare conjunction that marked renewal in the cosmic order. To them, it was not about worship but recognition. They saw in the birth of that story a reflection of their oldest truth, that light returns when darkness grows heavy. The Vatican would later honour the Magi as saints, but it never spoke of their doctrine. Their true gospel was too free, too direct, too dangerous. They had taught that heaven was not a place, but a state of being, created by every thought that chooses truth over deceit. And that, perhaps, is the greatest miracle they ever offered the world. There are places in the world where fire still breathes, not as destruction, not as symbol, but as mind. The Atash Berem, the great fire temple of the Zoroastrians, is one such place. Step inside and you feel it immediately, the air shimmering, alive, as if the flame itself is watching. It is not worshipped as a god, but tended as a presence. The priests say the fire remembers. Every spark is a continuation of the first light that entered the world. Every breath of air that feeds it is a promise to keep truth alive. In these temples there are no idols, no painted faces or golden statues. Only the fire, the purest element, burning without smoke, without end. Its maintenance is sacred science. Every movement within the chamber follows a rhythm of cleansing and renewal. Sand and ash are used to keep the floor pure. No shadow must fall across the flame. Each log is chosen with care, washed before being added. The keepers wear white robes, symbols of clarity. To them, fire is consciousness in motion, the the visible shape of divine awareness. It transforms everything it touches, yet remains unchanged. In that way, they say, it mirrors truth. It burns away the false, but never consumes the real. The teachings within these walls are not sermons but reflections. Purity, they say, is not the absence of sin but the presence of order. When a mind aligns with truth, it shines like the sacred fire. When it strays, it smoulders in confusion. The flame teaches without words. Watching it long enough, one begins to understand that clarity is not given by others, it is chosen. The fire temples were more than places of worship. They were schools of discipline and philosophy. Astronomers studied the stars beside theologians, and healers mixed herbs while priests recited verses of light. Every art was sacred because every art served life. The idea that purity could exist without priestly permission made other powers uneasy. When Rome and later the Church rose to dominance, they could not allow such independence. A faith where every person could tend the inner flame left no room for intermediaries, so they changed the story. They called the Persians fire worshippers, idolaters, pagans. They reduced a philosophy of consciousness to superstition. Yet the flame still burned. Even through conquest and exile, the Zoroastrians carried embers from one temple to another, across deserts and oceans, keeping the lineage unbroken. Each Atash Berem is said to contain traces of that original fire, passed hand to hand through centuries of silence. Today, in cities like Yazd and Mumbai, those fires still live, tended by the descendants of the Magi. The priests still whisper the old verse that no empire could erase. The flame is not God, they say, but it is how God speaks. Look into it long enough, and you begin to see not a burning element, but your own awareness staring back. They tried to burn it, but the words would not die. The Avesta, the sacred scripture of Zoroaster, was said to have once filled 12,000 cowhides with ink and light. It told of creation, conscience, and the laws of truth. When Alexander of Macedon conquered Persia in the 4th century before Christ, his generals torched the libraries of Persepolis. Scrolls turned to smoke, temples to ash, and yet something lingered. The invaders could not destroy memory. The priests who survived carried verses in their minds, reciting them by moonlight, preserving each syllable like breath itself. What remained of the Avesta became fragments, pages scattered across time, stitched together by faith. The Greeks called it superstition, the Romans called it myth, and later the Church called it blasphemy. But still, it survived. A few charred pieces surfaced centuries later, their margins marked by strange notes in an unfamiliar hand. Some lines were crossed out, others replaced by Latin glosses. Beside one erased passage, a careful note read, "Removed for safety." Scholars debate what that meant. Safety from who? Or for who? The language of the Avesta was difficult. Its sound unlike anything in Europe. Translators often reshaped its meaning to fit their beliefs. Where the original spoke of light as wisdom, later versions turned it into divine fire. Where it said truth is the foundation of being, it was reworded as obedience to law. Little by little, philosophy became doctrine. Yet the oldest copies, the ones hidden in caves near Yazd, still carried the pure voice of Zarathustra. They told of a god of light, Ahura Mazda, not distant or vengeful, but radiant with knowledge. He asked for no sacrifice, no fear, only truthfulness. He taught that every person is a warrior in the great choice between good and evil, that even gods cannot intervene in the moral struggle of a human heart. Those ideas terrified conquerors. They could rule bodies, but not free minds. In the Middle Ages, Persian merchants whispered that a nearly complete Avesta had reached the West disguised as medical texts. A Vatican inventory from the 15th century lists a book titled Codex Persicus, later crossed out with a single word beside it, lost. Some believe it was not lost at all. Perhaps it lies locked behind the same walls where the church keeps its heretical relics, labelled and forgotten. What frightened them was not the words themselves, but what they implied. That the divine spark could never be owned, and that truth, once known, makes authority unnecessary. The Avesta taught that the purest flame is the mind awakened. Empires have tried to bury that thought for 2,000 years, yet here we are, still speaking its name. Paper can burn, ink can fade, but an idea, once lit, becomes fire. And fire, as the old priests knew, always finds air to breathe. Beneath the marble streets of ancient Rome, in chambers carved out of the earth, men gathered in secret to worship the Sunday. They called themselves the followers of Mithra, the god of light, the protector of truth, and the bridge between heaven and earth. Their temples, known as Mithraea, were hidden behind unmarked doors, lit only by torches and the flicker of sacred flame. Inside, the air was thick with incense and silence. Frescoes showed stars turning above a bull, a serpent coiling around the earth, and a young god slaying darkness with his blade of light. It was a religion of mystery, born in Persia and carried west by soldiers, merchants, and dreamers. By the 1st century before Christ, it had taken root in Rome itself. Mithra's message was simple but dangerous. He taught that the universe was a living order, that each person had to climb the cosmic ladder of virtue through courage, honesty, and duty. Salvation was not given by priests. It was earned through discipline. The sun was his symbol, not as a god to be feared, but as the eye of truth that sees all deception. The initiates called themselves the Sons of the Sun, and their motto was act with honour, live with light. Their rituals were not for the weak. To join, one passed through 7 stages, each representing a planet and a trial of the soul. The first test was of the moon, where the initiates swore silence. Then Mercury, the test of truth. Mars, the trial of courage. Each step brought them closer to the sun, and to the understanding that divinity was not above, but within. When Rome's emperors discovered these secret temples, they were intrigued. Mithraism spread through the legions faster than any law. Soldiers believed that the god of light marched with them, that no enemy could conquer one who carried truth in his heart. But as the empire aged, another faith began to rise, one that also promised light, order, and redemption. The Church. The early Christians and the Mithraic Brotherhood often shared symbols, the cross of the sun, the chalice, even the day of worship. But one crucial difference set them apart. The Mithraic path made every believer responsible for his own soul. The Church offered to carry that burden for you through obedience. That difference made Mithra a threat. By the 4th century after Christ, when Constantine turned the empire toward Christianity, the Mithraea were sealed, their flames extinguished, their altars buried. The Church adopted many of their symbols, the halo of light, the date of December 25th, the feast of the unconquered sun, but erased the name of the god who inspired them. Even today, under Rome's cathedrals, you can still find the old vaults of Mithra, walls painted with stars, the scent of old fire still trapped in stone. The empire may have changed gods, but the sun never stopped shining. In the quiet halls of early Christendom, long after the fires of Mithra's temples dimmed, another kind of flame was being tended, not one of devotion, but of redaction. It was the age of councils, where scribes gathered by candlelight to decide what the world would remember and what it would forget. The meetings were not battles of swords, but of sentences, a slow rewriting of truth disguised as translation. Among the scrolls brought to these councils were texts from the East, Persian writings that spoke of a faith built on truth, light, and the harmony of mind. They called it the worship of wisdom, Mazdayasna, the path of good thought, good word, and good deed. But the scribes found its message too dangerous. It made morality a choice, not a command. It placed truth in the heart, not the temple. And so the edits began. The Zoroastrian triad of Asher, the cosmic law of truth, was quietly transformed. In one translation, it became influence, a passive echo rather than an active principle. Later, the same word was redefined as error, a deviation from faith. By the time the final copies were approved, Asher had been recast as absence, the opposite of divine grace. Truth, once the heartbeat of creation, was turned into something humans could not reach without permission. The names changed too. Mithra, once the guardian of contracts and honesty, became a fallen spirit of deception. Anahita, the goddess of purity and waters, was renamed and woven into the stories of saints. Even Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Light, was split, his qualities scattered among angels and their opposites. The goal was not destruction, but absorption. To erase a rival faith completely would raise suspicion, but to absorb its virtues into a new system ensured no one would ever trace them back. The calendars were also rewritten. Where Zoroastrian months followed the rhythm of the stars, the church adjusted them to fit feast days and holy cycles. Festivals, once honouring the renewal of fire, became days for martyrdom. The spring celebration of light's triumph over darkness became Easter. The sun's rebirth in winter became Christmas. Line by line, year by year, the cosmic map of the ancients was replaced by a chronology that pointed toward the church as the keeper of time itself. A few dissenting monks left notes in the margins, quiet warnings that too much was being lost. One wrote that he had seen a Persian text burned because it claimed the divine spark lived within every person. Another wrote that these edits were necessary, that people needed faith, not freedom. The councils continued, and the new version of truth took hold. By the 6th century, hardly anyone remembered that the foundation of Western morality had once come from a Persian prophet who preached that truth was the only prayer worth saying. And somewhere, deep beneath the ink and dust of those meetings, the original light flickered on, waiting to be remembered again. The story of the Star of Bethlehem is one of the most famous in the world, a light in the sky guiding wise men to a manger. But what if that light wasn't a miracle at all? What if it was a calculation, predicted centuries before the story was ever written, by astronomer priests from the East, who understood the heavens better than anyone in Rome? In ancient Persia, long before Christianity took shape, Zoroastrian scholars charted the sky with mathematical precision. They built stone observatories that tracked the movement of planets, the rise of constellations, and the shifting of solstices. They believed the stars were not gods, but reflections of divine order, a cosmic clock revealing truth through pattern. Among their most sacred tools were the ephemerides, tables that recorded planetary positions across years and centuries. These records allowed the Magi to predict rare conjunctions, moments when planets met so closely that they appeared as a single brilliant star. One such event, a conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn in the constellation of Pisces, occurred around the year 7 before Christ, the same time many historians now place the birth of the biblical story. For the Persians, Jupiter symbolized divine kingship, Saturn represented time and authority, and Pisces was the sign of renewal. To the Magi, this was not a star announcing a saviour's birth. It was the universe marking the beginning of a new age. The Church would later retell this as divine prophecy fulfilled, but the science had existed long before the faith. Ancient records from Babylon and Persia show these same conjunctions noted with precise dates. The Magi who followed the star were not witnesses to a miracle. They were the miracle makers, interpreters of cosmic rhythm, carrying knowledge passed down from Zoroaster himself. When they reached Judea, they were not looking for a religion. They were confirming an alignment. To them, the light in the sky was not about one man. It was about the eternal cycle of light overcoming darkness. But when the story was rewritten centuries later, the meaning changed. The Magi became props. Their science turned into faith, their observation into worship. The Church claimed the star as its own, a sign of divine approval. The truth, however, glimmers in forgotten manuscripts. In old Persian star charts, the same conjunction is described with care, its position, brightness, and duration mapped across weeks. It was not called the Star of Bethlehem. It was called the Meeting of Kings. That phrase carried two meanings, one celestial, one human. The heavens meeting the earth, and the wise meeting the newly born symbol of light. The Vatican later displayed paintings of the Magi kneeling before the Christ child, but none of those paintings show the tools they carried, the compasses, scrolls, and charts that made them what they were. Astronomers, not followers. Scientists, not saints. The star was theirs long before it was borrowed, and though history tried to rename it, the heavens have never changed their story. In the heart of Alexandria, where the Mediterranean light once fell through marble colonnades, there stood a library that was said to hold all the wisdom of the ancient world. Scholars came from every corner of the earth to study there. Persians, Greeks, Egyptians, and Indians, all speaking different tongues but sharing the same hunger to understand. Among its endless shelves was a small section labelled simply Eastern Codices. Most passed it by without notice, but one name in a surviving catalogue entry still sparks curiosity. Avestan Codices, rescued from Persepolis. The note is dated to the 3rd century before Christ, the same era when Alexander's fires had consumed the Persian archives. Somehow, a few manuscripts had survived, carried across deserts by scribes who believed that words could outlast empires. These were said to be written in the Old Avestan tongue, the language of Zoroaster, describing the creation of light, the laws of truth, and the rhythm of the stars. For centuries, they sat in the library's vaults, translated and studied by philosophers who admired their purity. They wrote of a moral code unlike any other, one where enlightenment was a process of understanding, not submission. Then, suddenly, they vanished. In a later copy of the same librarian's ledger, the line mentioning the Avestan Codices is gone. In its place, a blank space, a single folio left untouched, as if something had been deliberately erased. The same ledger contains other records, scrolls about astronomy, geometry, and medicine, but nowhere else is there a blank, just one. Some historians think the missing entry disappeared during one of the fires that struck the library, but others suspect something quieter, censorship. During the rise of the early church, Alexandria became a battlefield of ideas. Christian scholars debated pagans, philosophers, and scientists. The church wanted to be the sole keeper of divine truth. The Avestan texts, with their message that wisdom is a light inside everyone, did not fit that vision. They taught that truth was self-evident, that morality could not be owned or enforced. In a world beginning to divide knowledge into sacred and forbidden, such words were dangerous. It is said that a bishop visiting Alexandria ordered certain scrolls sealed for review, their contents to be judged by the newly forming councils of faith. The librarian who kept the ledger may have obeyed, but left his protest in silence. That blank page, scholars now believe, was not a mistake, but a message, a whisper of what was lost. The codices of Persepolis had already survived one fire. The second came not from flame, but from fear. What burned this time was not parchment, but memory. Yet, in rare footnotes found in other texts, fragments of those Avestan verses resurface, lines about truth as light and light as life. The library may have fallen, but somewhere beyond the ashes, those ideas found other keepers, because real fire, the kind born from understanding, can never truly be put out. Long before pulpits and pews, long before laws told people what was good and what was evil, there was a man who said that truth was not something given from above, but chosen from within. His name was Zoroaster, and his message was as simple as it was dangerous. Every human being, he said, holds the power to decide between Asher, the truth, and Druj, the lie. No priest can choose it for you. No ritual can erase it. Every sunrise is a new chance to decide what kind of world you help create. To the ancient empires, this was heresy. A ruler's power depended on the belief that morality came from authority, that the gods favoured kings, and that priests were the interpreters of divine will. Zoroaster shattered that idea. He told farmers and shepherds that their thoughts mattered as much as a king's prayers, that the smallest act of honesty held more power than 1,000 sacrifices. He called Asher the rhythm of the universe, the harmony that keeps light and darkness in balance. Druj was its distortion, the lie that breeds chaos and fear. To live in truth, he said, is to align your heart with creation itself. To live in the lie is to feed destruction. The choice was personal, immediate, and constant. You could not buy forgiveness. You could only live it. For many, it was liberating. For the powerful, it was terrifying. A world where every person carries divine responsibility leaves no room for control. So as his teachings spread from Persia to Babylon, and later to Greece and Rome, they were reshaped, softened, and hidden. Later religions borrowed his symbols, but buried his meaning. The light became an external savior instead of an inner awakening. The fight between good and evil became a story of angels and demons instead of the struggle within the human mind. The Church, centuries later, would call free will a gift, but Zoroaster saw it as a burden, a sacred test written into the fabric of reality. You cannot escape it, because every thought tips the scale. Even silence is a choice. Ancient Persian inscriptions still echo his vision. They describe not commandments, but commitments. Be truthful in thought, be kind in word, be just in action. These were not rules for worship. They were instructions for creation. He believed that each act of truth strengthens the very structure of existence, while every lie weakens it. To tell a falsehood was not just sin, it was an act of cosmic sabotage. This belief, that humans share responsibility for the balance of the universe, made priests unnecessary. And that was the beginning of the problem. The moment Zoroaster told humanity it did not need intermediaries, he lit a fire no empire could fully control. Across centuries, his name was distorted, his scriptures lost, but his idea never died. The heresy of free will became the heartbeat of every revolution that refused to kneel. Because once a person realizes that truth begins inside, no wall of power can ever fully contain their light. To most of the ancient world, cleanliness was a luxury. Streets ran with waste, rivers doubled as sewers, and sickness was seen as punishment from the gods. But in Persia, centuries before the birth of modern medicine, purity was science. Zoroastrians built their faith around it, not as superstition, but as technology. They believed water, earth, and fire were sacred because they sustained life, and to pollute them was to harm creation itself. Every ritual, every law, every daily act was designed to protect those elements. Over time, their devotion became engineering. Archaeologists have found ancient qanats, underground canals that carried water for miles through stone-lined tunnels, keeping it cool and clean. These were not primitive wells. They were precise systems of gradient and airflow, still functioning in some deserts today. At every source, priests performed a ceremony called the Abzor, an offering to purify the waters. They spoke of honoring creation, but what they were really doing was ensuring sanitation. They understood contamination long before the word existed. Fire, too, was treated as medicine. In the great temples, flames burned inside chambers ventilated to filter smoke and ash. Only dry, clean wood could be used, and no breath was allowed to touch the fire. These rules seemed obsessive to outsiders, but they created some of the cleanest air in the ancient world. The same precision extended to burial. While others burned their dead or buried them in soil, the Zoroastrians placed bodies atop stone towers, exposed to the sun and wind until only clean bones remained. It was not cruelty, it was environmental design. They understood decomposition spread disease. By returning only purified remains to the earth, they kept water sources safe. Later, cultures mocked these practices as strange, even barbaric. But centuries later, When plagues swept through Europe, the same people who dismissed Persian rituals died by the millions from contaminated wells and airless cities. The irony is sharp. What religion called purity, science would one day call hygiene. When the Church encountered these customs through conquest and translation, it rebranded them. Washing before prayer became ritual, not necessity. Lighting a candle became symbolism, not airflow control. The engineering behind the faith was erased, replaced with mystery. But in the ruins of Persepolis and the fire temples of Yazd, the truth still speaks. Stone channels carved with millimeter precision. Vent shafts designed to keep flames alive for centuries. Water reservoirs aligned to the movement of the stars. These were not the works of mystics. They were the inventions of people who believed that caring for the world was the highest form of worship. Their priests were scientists, their temples laboratories. And when the conquerors called it superstition, it was only because they did not understand that the rituals they mocked were saving lives. To the Persians, purity was not just faith. It was technology wrapped in prayer, proof that enlightenment can live in the smallest act of preservation, and that the sacred and the scientific have always been the same flame, burning in different languages. When the great Persian Empire fell to conquest and fire, not every flame went out. Some of it was carried away, hidden in cloth, tucked between the pages of books, and guarded by hands that refused to forget. These hands belonged to the Parsis, a line of Zoroastrian exiles who fled westward along the Silk Road, carrying with them the last fragments of the Avesta and the memory of a world built on light. They were merchants by trade, scholars by devotion, and wanderers by destiny. In every city they reached, from Samarkand to Gujarat, they built small temples where fire burned quietly behind heavy doors. The world around them changed, kingdoms rose and fell, but the fire stayed. It was their compass and their conscience. What began as exile became a mission. When the priests left Persia, they took not only scripture but knowledge. They carried charts of the stars, formulas for irrigation, and medicinal recipes drawn from centuries of study. They traded these for survival, offering wisdom in exchange for passage, light for shelter. On the surface, they sold spices, silk, and gems, but within their caravans, folded inside bolts of fabric, were pages written in Avestan ink. Some bore prayers, others bore equations. Each was a spark of memory smuggled across time. Along the Silk Road, they became known not just as traders, but as keepers of clarity. In markets lit by oil lamps, a few quiet men in white robes would speak of balance, honesty, and the eternal struggle between truth and the lie. To them, business itself was a sacred act. Every fair trade was a prayer to Asher, every deception a bow to Druge. Even in foreign lands, they lived by the old law of good thought, good word, good deed. Their honesty made them trusted, and trust kept them alive. When they reached the western coast of India, they found refuge. The local rulers granted them land, and there, under new skies, they rebuilt their fire temples. From that moment, the flame of Zoroaster burned again, not in its birthplace, but in its promise. These Parsis became the custodians of daylight, preserving not just ritual but reason. They founded schools, translated fragments of the Avesta into Sanskrit, and sent copies back along the trade routes to scholars who still searched for the lost texts. For centuries, their faith survived without conquest, without conversion, only continuity. Every time an empire tried to erase the old wisdom, another caravan carried it onward, disguised as commerce. The merchants of light became bridges between worlds, between ancient Persia and modern civilization. Even today, in Mumbai and Yazd, their descendants still tend fires that trace their origin to that first exile. The flame burns in silence, yet it speaks of resilience, of knowledge disguised as devotion, of memory that refuses to fade. The Parsis proved that faith does not need armies or thrones to endure. It only needs people who remember that light is meant to be shared, and that even the smallest ember, when carried with care, can outlast the longest night. In the dim glow of early Christendom, when Rome struggled to define its soul after centuries of empire, something subtle began to unfold. It was not a conquest by sword, but by translation. The gods of older worlds were rewritten, their meanings rearranged until they no longer threatened the rising faith. Among them was Mithras, once the radiant protector of truth, the solar saviour who guarded the balance of heaven and earth. His name had once been spoken by kings and soldiers alike, but now, in the hands of new theologians, he became something else entirely. The same figure who once represented light's triumph over darkness was recast as its enemy. His temples were renamed tombs of idolatry. His worshippers were branded as deceivers. In Rome's new mythology, the god of light became a shadow, the reflection turned upside down. Ahura Mazda, the supreme being of Zoroastrianism, was not erased but transformed. The West absorbed his image, stripped of his context, and presented it as a singular monotheism, unconnected to its source. Where the Persians saw light as living wisdom, Rome saw authority. The cosmic dualism of Asher and Druj, truth and the lie, was simplified into obedience and sin. Choice became submission. Freedom became faith. It was a quiet revolution that reshaped how the world understood morality. For centuries, Persian philosophy had taught that good and evil were forces of consciousness, living inside every person, both demanding recognition. The Church turned that inward struggle into an external hierarchy. Evil was no longer a distortion of truth within, but a distant enemy to be fought by creed and command. The light that once burned inside the human heart was relocated to heaven, beyond reach, accessible only through intercession. The shift was deliberate. The old dualism gave people responsibility. The new order gave them dependency. The moral universe shrank from participation to obedience. The Church could then decide what counted as truth and what did not. To question that order became rebellion, and rebellion became heresy. In the archives of late Rome, records still mention Mithraic initiates accused of demon worship, their sacred symbols confiscated and renamed. The serpent, once representing time, became the emblem of evil. The bull, once symbolizing fertility, became the beast of sin. Every element of their myth was inverted until nothing true remained. But symbols have long memories. Even in the mosaics of early basilicas, you can still find traces of Mithraic patterns, stars in the same positions, rays of the same Sunday. They linger like ghosts of a forgotten origin, reminders that light cannot be rewritten, only reframed. Rome's shadow play was clever. It did not destroy its rivals. It simply used their shapes to build its own story, changing meaning while keeping the form. By the time the world forgot who Mithras and Ahura Mazda truly were, the illusion was complete. The faith of light had been turned into a doctrine of control, and beneath the glow of stained glass and candle flame, the shadow of that exchange still moves quietly across history's walls. In the year 1661, deep inside the Vatican's observatory, a Jesuit astronomer named Matteo Ricci, the Younger, made a discovery that would quietly end his career. He had been granted permission to study ancient sky tables, said to have come from the East, records of planetary movement, unlike anything in the Church's archives. These charts were written in a strange script that few could read, but Ricci recognized symbols from an earlier study of Persian manuscripts. The language was Avestan, the same tongue spoken by Zoroaster's priests nearly 2,000 years before Christ. What caught his attention was not their beauty, but their precision. The tables mapped conjunctions of planets across centuries, with calculations that matched the newest European instruments almost perfectly. Yet these charts were older than the telescope itself. Ricci began to compare them to the Church's official chronologies, the timelines used to mark creation, flood, and prophecy. The more he compared, the more the numbers disagreed. The Persian tables placed key astronomical events hundreds of years earlier than the biblical calendar allowed. A rare planetary alignment that the Church called divine omen had been predicted and recorded by Zoroastrian astronomers long before any Christian prophecy existed. Ritchie's letters from that year describe his astonishment. He wrote that the Persians had treated the heavens not as mystery, but as mathematics, seeing divinity in pattern rather than intervention. His conclusion was bold. The Avestan sky tables, he said, were evidence of an older science of time, one that had influenced every later cosmology, even the churches. But when he shared his findings with the librarian of the Apostolic Archive, access to the charts was suddenly revoked. The official reason was restoration, but the real reason soon became clear. Within weeks, Ritchie's notes were confiscated for review, his copies seized, and his correspondence cut short. Later, Jesuit records list him as reassigned to a remote mission in Malta. No cause is mentioned. His remaining notebooks survive only in fragments, preserved by a friend who refused to burn them. In one, written in fading brown ink, Ritchie had drawn two circles overlapping. Beneath it, he wrote, "They called it the meeting of worlds." To him, that phrase meant more than astronomy. It was proof that the bridge between science and spirit had once existed and had been severed by fear. The Church could not allow the possibility that pagan astronomers had measured the universe with greater accuracy than Christian scholars. It undermined divine revelation. It questioned authority. After Ritchie's silence, the Avestan charts disappeared from public record. Some historians believe they were returned to the secret section of the archive, labelled Persica, the same vault rumoured to hold manuscripts taken from Persepolis centuries earlier. Others think they were destroyed, but in the margin of one surviving Jesuit ledger, written beside Ritchie's name, is a single Latin word, reticere. To keep silent. It was both a command and a warning. And from that silence, a century of knowledge quietly vanished into darkness once more. There are pages in the Vatican's Great Index that seem to whisper even in silence. Lists of forbidden books, burned works, and lost translations stretch for centuries. An inventory of things humanity was not meant to read. Yet hidden among the names of known heresies are spaces where nothing is written, as if the ink itself was afraid to touch the paper. Archivists call them gaps, places where a title was meant to exist but does not. Some of these absences have notes beside them, faint marks in Latin. Ordinances of fire, councils of the Magavan, no author, no location, no explanation, just silence shaped like a book. The index of prohibited texts began in the 16th century, when the Church sought to protect the faithful from dangerous ideas. It was meant to be a tool of guidance, but it became a map of disappearance. Every edition added new absences, each one more mysterious than the last. Among the few scholars who have studied the old ledgers, some noticed patterns. The missing entries appear most often beside references to Persia, Egypt, or Chaldea, regions whose philosophies once spoke of inner light and moral freedom. It was as if entire civilizations had been edited out of history. The Ordinances of Fire was rumoured to be a translation of Zoroastrian hymns describing the structure of sacred flame, how it symbolises awareness itself. The councils of the Magavan supposedly contained parables from the priestly orders of ancient Iran, moral riddles meant to train perception, not obedience. Neither title appears in any other archive. Only in the Vatican's index, as if they had existed just long enough to be erased. A letter from a 17th century librarian survives in which he complains that entire volumes have been removed from his catalogue without notice. He writes that certain books were being handled by an unnamed committee, their pages copied or locked away in sealed rooms. He calls it the culling of the embers, a phrase that chills even now. What were they afraid of? Perhaps ideas that could reignite the memory of a world where faith and knowledge were one flame. Perhaps texts that described a God who needed no mediator. The Church feared chaos, but the real threat was freedom. By the 19th century, the index had grown into thousands of entries. Yet, among its rows of condemnation, the gaps remained. Some clerks tried to fill them, others ignored them. But those who looked closely noticed faint smudges where ink had once been, the outline of vanished titles, burned yet not gone. The Vatican later declared the index closed, but no one ever said it was empty. Deep in the archive, the missing books still cast their invisible glow. The ordinances of fire, the councils of the Magavan, names without pages, flames without smoke. And maybe that is the point. Not all embers burn in sight. Some are meant to wait in the dark until the world remembers how to see their light again. Across the cathedrals of Europe, saints rest in marble and gold. Their bones lie behind glass, wrapped in silk, their names carved in Latin. Pilgrims kneel, candles flicker, choirs echo. But if you look closely at some of those relics, you find something strange. In the dust of forgotten inscriptions, beneath the gilded frames, there are words not written in Latin or Greek, but in Persian. Letters curved like flames, fragments of another world. Scholars who examined them in the 19th century were puzzled. Some of these bones, labelled as saints from the early church, had come from the East long before Christianity reached those lands. The relics bore carvings of stars and fire altars, symbols known from Zoroastrian temples, not from catacombs. They were not Christian martyrs at all. They were magi, priests of light, whose remains had travelled through trade routes and empires before being renamed as saints. Somewhere between faith and conquest, the identities were rewritten. Hagiographies, the biographies of saints, were tools of devotion, but also tools of replacement. When the church spread through the old trade networks, it found shrines already sacred, tombs already venerated. Rather than destroy them, they were rebranded. Persian sages became local saints. Caravan markers became pilgrimage sites. Every renaming erased a path. Every translation burned a map. What had once been part of the Silk Road's spiritual geography was folded into the story of Rome. The names changed, but the bones remained. One relic in southern France, said to belong to Saint Amator, bears a small bronze tag inscribed with an Avestan verse. It reads, "Light is born where truth is spoken." Another in Venice carries a stone carved with a Faravahar, the winged emblem of the Persian soul. For centuries, no one questioned it. The faithful prayed, and the scholars kept quiet. But archives hold clues. A 14th century merchant's record from Cyprus mentions a shipment of Eastern relics sold to a Venetian monastery, bones of wise men, firekeepers from Yazd, traded for silver and safe passage. Perhaps those relics are still displayed, wearing new names. The idea is unsettling, but also poetic. It means the East was never fully silenced. Its teachers still rest in the heart of Europe, hidden under halos carved by other hands. The story of sainthood is not always a lie, but sometimes it is a mask, a way of preserving what could not be publicly honoured. The Magi, who followed the stars, became saints who followed the cross. Their journey did not end with conversion, it ended with concealment. Yet, in a strange way, the old truth still glows beneath the surface. The fire that once burned in Persian temples found refuge in cathedrals. The bones of those who guarded light still lie beneath altars, waiting for someone to read the language carved into them. And when they do, the story of faith may not collapse. It may simply expand, revealing that the saints of Europe and the sages of Persia were never truly strangers, only reflections of the same eternal flame. Walk into any great cathedral in Europe, and you can feel the silence hum. Light spills through stained glass like liquid fire, crawling across the floor as the sun moves. Most visitors see beauty. Few realize they are standing inside a message carved in stone. The cathedrals tell on themselves. Their geometry, their light, even their shadows, whisper of older architects, of patterns not born in Rome but carried from Persia long before the church took credit. The builders of these sanctuaries were not just masons. They were inheritors of ancient knowledge, fragments of Zoroastrian and Mithraic design smuggled into Christian architecture under new names. When you stand beneath a rose window, watching the sunlight ignite the coloured glass at dawn, you are witnessing a ritual that began in a fire temple thousands of miles away. The circle of light was sacred to the Magi. It symbolized Asher, the perfect order of the cosmos. The same geometry appears in cathedrals from Chartres to Amiens, where every curve of the window aligns with the sun's position during the equinox. It is not coincidence. It is memory set in stone. The labyrinths on cathedral floors, which pilgrims trace with slow, reverent steps, were not inventions of the medieval church either. They mirror the ancient paths of initiation used by Persian priests to train, focus, and humility, a physical meditation on the journey of the soul through illusion toward truth. In some temples, fire once burned at the center of those mazes. In the cathedrals, that fire was replaced by the cross, but the path remained. The masons knew what they were preserving. They called their designs divine inspiration, but their blueprints show precise astronomical alignment. The cathedral at Chartres faces the rising sun on the morning of the spring equinox, the same moment when Zoroastrians celebrate the renewal of light. Even the placement of windows and towers follows cosmic rhythm. These were not accidents of art, they were codes of continuity. As the church grew in power, it absorbed not just theology, but architecture. The builders borrowed what worked, the patterns that made people feel awe, the mathematics that made light behave like revelation. Over time, the origins were forgotten or deliberately hidden. The official story became one of divine creativity, not inheritance. But stone does not lie. Its angles remember. Every rose window that blooms with sunlight, every arch that captures dawn, is a confession. Beneath the Christian symbols are Persian fingerprints, the same sacred ratios found in fire temples where light was treated as consciousness. The cathedrals became palimpsests, old truths rewritten but never erased. When you stand in one today and feel something awaken, something you cannot name, that is the echo of what they tried to bury. The sense that light itself is holy, the feeling that truth was never meant to belong to one faith, but to everyone who dares to look up. The cathedrals are beautiful, but their beauty is borrowed, built from the memory of a flame that still burns in the heart of time. There was a time when truth had to wear a disguise. In the candlelit laboratories of medieval Europe, men in heavy robes mixed metals and whispered prayers, pretending to turn lead into gold. To the church, they were scientists seeking treasure. But behind the smoke and symbols, something else was happening. Alchemy was not about gold, it was about the soul, and its language, strange and secret, came from Persia. The ancient Zoroastrians had long spoken of the world as a living chemistry. They believed that matter was a mirror of mind, and that to purify one was to heal the other. When their teachings reached Europe through Arabic translations, the philosophers of the West rewrote them, hiding spiritual laws inside recipes for transformation. Sulfur, they said, was the spirit. Mercury was the mind. Salt was the body. But those were not elements of nature. They were the ingredients of consciousness. The alchemists were not melting metal. They were refining character. Yet, in a world ruled by censorship, they could not say this openly. To speak of the divine spark within humans was dangerous. To claim that enlightenment required no priest was heresy. So they turned wisdom into chemistry and faith into metaphor. When they wrote of furnaces and crucibles, they were describing meditation. When they spoke of fire purifying lead, they meant truth burning away ignorance. The golden light they sought was not in matter, but in understanding. Some of them, like Paracelsus in the 16th century, hinted at this in their writings. He said that all healing comes from balancing the three principles within. The same triad the Persians had once called thought, word, and deed. Others, like the Rosicrucians, spoke in riddles of an inner sun echoing Zoroastrian fire. Their manuscripts passed hand to hand, copied in secret, because knowledge that freed the mind was more dangerous than any weapon. The Church tolerated alchemy as long as it stayed alchemical. Gold was acceptable. God within was not. So the adepts learned to whisper. They wrote in symbols, drew their truths in circles and serpents, and buried Persian philosophy beneath layers of Latin metaphor. To those who knew how to read them, the old teachings lived on. The philosopher's stone was not a rock but realization, the moment when matter and spirit are seen as one. In that instant, the alchemist becomes what the Magi once were, a keeper of light disguised as a worker of metal. Even today, the old drawings survive, suns rising from flasks, angels holding scales of fire and water. They look mystical, but they are maps of consciousness. The Persians called it Asher. The Europeans called it the Great Work. Both meant the same thing, the perfection of truth through self-knowledge. Alchemy was never about turning metal into treasure. It was about turning the heart into light, the same light that once burned in the fire temples of Persia, still flickering beneath the coded language of those who refused to let wisdom die. The Persians believed that truth was not a word, not a rule, not even a choice. It was a law. They called it Asher, the structure beneath everything, the rhythm that keeps the stars in their paths and the heart in its beat. To live in Asher was to live in harmony with reality itself. To live outside it was to live in illusion. Zoroaster taught that this law did not belong to gods or kings. It existed before them and would remain after them. Truth was not a decree to be obeyed. It was a mirror to be recognized. When people looked into that mirror and saw clearly, fear lost its hold. Institutions built on fear began to tremble because Asher required no authority. It only required honesty. In ancient Persia, Asher was not just philosophy. It was the foundation of law, architecture, even medicine. Builders designed temples according to its symmetry. Judges ruled by its fairness. Healers treated the body as a reflection of the cosmic order. The idea was simple but revolutionary. Truth was not created by power. Power existed to serve truth. Every person, from farmer to priest, was responsible for maintaining balance by living truthfully. Asher was light, and light had no hierarchy. The early church could not accept that. For its structure to survive, truth had to be something only it could interpret. The moment truth became universal, the system of control dissolved, so the definition changed. Truth was turned into doctrine. Asher became faith. Its mirror was covered by commandments, its light filtered through ritual. The idea that every human could reflect divine order was buried beneath centuries of theology. But ideas like that never die. They hide in plain sight, waiting for eyes that still remember how to see. When people live by fear, they become predictable. When they live by truth, they become free. That was Zoroaster's secret, and that is why his words were feared. He did not promise salvation after death. He promised awakening now. He said that Asher is the breath of the universe. It moves through everyone. To lie, to deceive, to exploit is to choke that breath. To act with honesty and compassion is to let it flow. In this sense, truth is not moral but mechanical. It is how reality works. When you distort it, the world resists. When you align with it, the world opens. Every empire that forgot this eventually fell, not because of armies, but because lies rot from within. Even today, the principle holds. Institutions that depend on fear fade when people begin to see through them. You cannot control those who understand that truth is self-sustaining. They need no savior, no permission, no approval. They become light. And when enough people reflect that light, something miraculous happens. Darkness loses its purpose. The mirror of Asher turns the world upright again, showing what was always there, a universe built on truth. waiting for us to stop pretending we cannot see it. In the city of Yazd, where wind towers rise above the desert and the air smells faintly of dust and fire, there is a story whispered among the priests of the old faith. They say that centuries ago, a monk copying manuscripts by candlelight found something unexpected between the pages of a Latin prayer book. It was a thin sheet of parchment written in two languages. On one side, Persian, on the other, Latin. The first line read, "From the guardians of fire to the children of water." No one knew who had written it, or how it had come to rest in that monastery so far from Persia. But its message was clear. It was a bridge, a letter between two worlds that were never meant to meet, proof that the current of knowledge had never fully stopped flowing. The monk who found it was young, trained to copy without question. But as he traced the letters by lamplight, he felt the rhythm of something older than doctrine. The Persian text spoke of light as awareness, of truth as motion, of the duty to protect both from corruption. It reminded its reader that fire and water are not enemies. One purifies the world above, the other the world below. Together they keep life balanced. The Latin translation softened the words, replacing truth with faith, replacing freedom with obedience. The monk noticed this and hesitated. For the first time, he saw how translation could become transformation. In the margin, he added a note that still survives in fragments today. He wrote, "The meaning is changed, but the spirit remains." Some believe this letter was part of a larger correspondence between Zoroastrian exiles and Christian mystics, a hidden dialogue that kept the philosophy of Asher alive within the church's own walls. The guardians of fire were the priests of Yazd, tending the eternal flames that had burned since before the fall of Persia. The children of water were monks of the Mediterranean coast, keepers of baptismal springs and healing fonts. Both saw purity as sacred, and both knew their symbols came from the same source. The letter urged unity, not conversion. It spoke of wisdom as a river, flowing from one vessel to another, never lost, only reshaped. When the Inquisition later searched the monastery, the parchment vanished, but copies had already been made. One surfaced in the archives of Lisbon in the 19th century, another in Bombay. Each carried the same closing line: "The fire still burns, and the water still sings. We have not forgotten." Those words echo even now, a quiet defiance across centuries of division. They remind us that no empire, no doctrine, no wall of language can fully sever truth from itself. It always finds a way back through the cracks. In the silence of Yazd's fire temples, the flames still sway like breathing, and somewhere, beyond deserts and oceans, the children of water still listen. The letter was real, not because of ink or paper, but because its message still moves between us. In the spring of 1978, a linguist named Dr. Elias Varma stood before a university lecture hall in Oxford and made a claim that would quietly end his career. He was a philologist, a specialist in the roots of language, and after 10 years of study, he had come to a conclusion that few wanted to hear. The moral vocabulary of Christianity, he said, did not begin in Jerusalem or Rome. It began in Persia. His research traced the structure of Christian ethics back to Avestan texts written more than 1,000 years before Christ. The familiar phrases of good and evil, salvation and sin, judgment and redemption, all had linguistic and conceptual parallels in the Avesta. The threefold moral formula of Zoroastrianism, good thoughts, good words, good deeds, had simply been rephrased, woven into new scripture and presented as revelation. It was not accusation, it was history. But history, especially sacred history, is fragile. Within weeks, his department received letters. Some were curious, others indignant. His peers praised his method but questioned his wisdom. Privately, a colleague warned him that certain donors were unhappy. The church had funded his institute for decades. If his findings gained attention, that funding would vanish. Dr. Varma refused to retract his work. He believed truth should not depend on comfort. In an interview, he said, "If we can trace our morality to its oldest roots, we see that light belongs to no one. It is shared." A month later, his grant renewal was denied. His access to archives was suspended for administrative review. His students were reassigned. By the end of the year, he was teaching part-time in a small college far from the city. His papers were never formally disproven. They were simply forgotten, yet copies survived. In one essay, he compared the Sermon on the Mount to the Gathas of Zoroaster, showing nearly identical themes. The meek inheriting the earth mirrored Zoroaster's verse about the humble who live in Asher. The call to forgive enemies echoed the Avesta's command to answer hatred with truth. Even the imagery of light overcoming darkness had travelled the same road from Persia to Palestine to Rome. Dr. Varma saw it not as theft, but as inheritance, a long chain of wisdom passed from one world to another. But such unity threatened the idea of exclusivity. If goodness had always existed, revelation lost its monopoly. The peer reviews of his final paper were polite, even complimentary, but none were published. In the margins of his notebook, he wrote a single line: "They cannot refute the light, so they close their eyes." He died in 1993, largely unknown. Years later, his former student found his unpublished manuscripts in a sealed box labelled Language of the Sunday. Reading them, she said it felt as though he had been trying to give the world back its memory. Maybe that is what truth always does. It refuses to die, even when the scholars who guard it are made to disappear. In the deepest corridors beneath Vatican City, beyond the rooms open to scholars and the guarded aisles of manuscripts, there is said to be a door without a label. Behind it, rumour claims, lies the Persica room. It does not appear on official maps of the Apostolic Archive, and yet fragments of internal memos mention it by name. A secure chamber, equipped with climate controls, sealed cabinets, and storage for materials of delicate origin. Only a few librarians are authorized to enter, and their names are never released. The story first surfaced in the 1950s, when a visiting historian noticed a gap in the catalogue numbers. Between two recorded collections, one on Mesopotamian tablets and another on early Christian codices, there was a blank space. The index simply jumped forward, skipping a section labelled Persica. When he asked about it, the archivist smiled and said that room no longer existed, but later, in a maintenance log, the historian found a line written in another hand and a different ink. Persica vault humidity adjusted to 30%. The note was dated that same month. Since then, whispers have circulated among researchers who study ancient religions. They say the vault holds manuscripts taken from Persia during the Crusades, including Avestan fragments once believed lost in the fires of Persepolis. Some believe these documents detail early cosmologies. Others claim they contain translations comparing Zoroastrian and Christian doctrines. The Vatican neither confirms nor denies it. When asked, officials insist that all materials of known origin are properly catalogued. Yet descriptions from internal reports suggest something else. The vault's cases are sealed in layered glass. Its environment is kept colder than any other room in the archive. A few technicians who have worked nearby mention faint writing on the door's edge, Latin words almost invisible beneath decades of paint. Lux occulta. Hidden light. Perhaps coincidence, perhaps confession. Theories abound. One suggests that the room was created in the 17th century to isolate texts considered heretical but too valuable to destroy. Another claims it was built during World War II to protect sensitive collections from bombing. Whatever its purpose, the Persica room remains off-limits. The logbook that once mentioned it now shows erasures and rewritten entries. Ink from 2 centuries layered over itself, names crossed out, access codes changed. It is as if history were being rewritten not on paper but in air. Some say the vault contains a complete copy of the ordinances of fire. Others, that it holds the Jesuit astronomers' missing charts from the 17th century. No one knows for certain. Perhaps it is empty. Perhaps that is the point. A room that exists only to hide the idea that something is hidden. But when archivists walk those lower halls, they say the air changes near that wall, cooler, sharper, as if a vacuum pulls from behind the stone. The vault has no key, at least none that opens from outside. Yet the thought of it lingers like a heartbeat, reminding us that truth, once locked away, has a strange way of waiting. There is a story told in the old Persian temples about a boy who asked the priest why they worshipped fire. The priest smiled and said, "We do not worship it, we remember it." The boy did not understand then, but he would one day. Because the secret of the sacred flame was never about firewood or smoke, it was about awareness. Zarathustra's oldest teaching was simple. The fire that burns in the temple is only a reflection of the one that burns in you. The universe, he said, is made of light and shadow, truth and the lie. Every thought and action feeds one or the other. The purpose of life is not to pray to the flame, but to become it. That was the core of his message, and it terrified those who built power from obedience. If every person carried divine fire within, no one needed to borrow it. No priest could sell access to it. No king could claim to control it. The sacred fire was conscience itself. Not a voice from above, but the quiet clarity that glows when you choose truth over deception, kindness over cruelty, understanding over fear. That is why Zoroastrian rituals treated the tending of fire as the highest honor. Every log added to the flame was a vow to keep awareness alive. Every spark was a reminder that the light must be fed daily through action. It was philosophy disguised as ceremony, psychology wrapped in prayer. Over centuries, others would imitate it. Candles on altars, lamps in sanctuaries, halos around saints, all echoes of that same truth. But somewhere along the way, the meaning shifted. The fire became something to observe, not embody. The symbol replaced the experience. Zarathustra had warned that would happen. He said that the lie always tries to separate people from what they already possess. It tells them they are too small for the divine, too flawed for wisdom. But the flame inside does not judge. It waits. It waits for the moment a person dares to look inward and realize that heaven is not above, but within. Modern thinkers call it conscience, but the ancients understood it as living light. They taught that if one person kept their inner flame pure, even in a world of darkness, the balance of creation could still be restored. It begins with choice. Every moment you decide what to feed, the light or the shadow. There is no ceremony greater than that, no prayer more powerful. You become the priest and the temple in one breath. That is the true initiation, the one the world keeps forgetting. Lighting the inner flame is not mystical, it is remembering. Remembering that the light you seek is already awake inside you, waiting for you to tend it. And once it burns, truly burns, nothing in the world can extinguish it, because that fire is not borrowed. It is you. It always begins with fragments. A page found in a desert cave. A burned line in a monastery ledger. A name scratched into a stone that should not exist. For centuries these clues lay scattered, dismissed as coincidences, too far apart to mean anything. But now, piece by piece, they are starting to align. Like stars reappearing after a long eclipse, they form a pattern, a map. And what that map points to is not a relic, not a religion, but a way of being that predates them all. The forgotten truth of Zoroaster's fire was never about worship. It was about living in alignment with truth itself. Asher, they called it the order of reality. To live in Asher was to live awake, to see the world not as divided between sacred and ordinary, but as one continuous field of choice. Every honest act fed the light. Every deceit dimmed it. The secret that survived the centuries was not how to pray, but how to remember that every thought, every word, every deed mattered. That realization was liberation, and liberation frightened the ones who built kingdoms on control. When people understood that salvation was not given but practiced, temples lost their monopoly. Thrones began to shake, so the story was buried. The Magi were recast as mystics. Their science was renamed superstition. Their language was lost to ashes. But light has a habit of finding cracks. In cathedrals built over fire temples, in alchemical diagrams, in forgotten gospels, the same message flickers back to life. It whispers that truth cannot be destroyed, only delayed. Across time, thinkers and seekers rediscover it without realizing they are speaking the same words, rediscovering the same law. That the divine is not waiting at the end of life, but reflected in every moment you choose honesty over fear. The dawn they could not stop is not a single event. It is happening slowly, through awareness returning. A historian in Paris connects Avestan maxims to early Christian ethics. A scientist in Tehran studies ancient Persian water rituals and calls them early environmental engineering. Artists rebuild the old symbols in new light, circles of fire, mirrors of truth, the same wisdom dressed in new colors. History is waking up. The old fragments are no longer whispers in libraries. They are speaking again. The map is reforming, and it points not to a hidden vault, but to us. Because the final secret was never in the manuscripts or the temples. It was in the people who could remember it. You do not need permission to live in truth. You only need to see it. That is the dawn they could not stop. A light that rises not from the horizon, but from within every person who chooses to remember what was once forbidden. The age of silence is ending, and the fire that once hid beneath the earth is beginning to breathe again.